my name's Carter, and I've been marsh fishing down here in the Florida Everglades for about 5 years now. There's something peaceful about being out on the water surrounded by nothing but sawgrass and cypress trees. Just you and nature. My buddy Travis and I try to get out there at least twice a month, usually targeting largemouth bass, and sometimes snook if we're lucky. The marshes around here are massive, stretching for miles in every direction, so it's pretty easy to find a spot where you won't run into anyone else. That's exactly how we like it. This happened back in early February, so the weather was actually pretty nice. Not too hot and not cold either. Travis and I decided to take his aluminum John boat out to this spot we'd been to a handful of times before. It's about a 20-minute ride from the boat launch, cutting through narrow channels lined with thick vegetation on both sides. The water's murky brown, stained from all the tannins in the cypress roots, and it's shallow enough in most places that you can see the bottom if you look hard enough. We got to our spot around mid-morning, right when the sun was starting to get high enough to warm things up. The area we chose was this little opening in the marsh where the water spread out into a pond-like formation, maybe 60 feet across. It was surrounded on all sides by dense walls of reeds and cattails that stood about 7 or 8 feet tall. Perfect ambush spot for bass. We'd been fishing for maybe 45 minutes, having pretty decent luck actually. I'd caught 2 bass already and Travis had 1. We were using topwater lures, watching them pop and splash across the surface, which is always entertaining even when the fish aren't biting. Travis was in the middle of telling me some story about his girlfriend when I noticed something that made me stop listening. On the far side of the pond, maybe 50 feet away from us, the reeds were moving. Not just swaying in the breeze, but moving like something was pushing through them. I pointed it out to Travis and he stopped talking mid-sentence, both of us watching the vegetation rustle and shake. At first I figured it was probably an alligator. We see them out here all the time, and they're usually not aggressive unless you do something stupid. But then the movement stopped, and whatever had been pushing through the reeds went completely still. Travis suggested we should probably move to a different spot, and I was inclined to agree. Something about the way those reeds had moved didn't sit right with me. But before we could start the motor, the reeds parted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach drop. It was a face. A human face, pale and partially obscured by the vegetation, but definitely human. And it was staring directly at us. I grabbed Travis's arm and whispered that there was someone in the reeds watching us. He squinted in that direction, trying to see what I was seeing, and after a few seconds, he saw it too. We both just sat there, frozen, staring back at this person who was staring at us from the marsh. The face didn't move, didn't blink as far as I could tell, just watched us with this blank, emotionless expression. Travis called out, asking if they needed help, if they were okay. His voice echoed across the water, but there was no response. The face just kept staring. I suggested maybe it was a hunter or another fisherman who was trying to stay hidden, but that didn't make any sense. Why would someone be standing waist deep in marsh water, hiding in the reeds in the middle of the day? And why wouldn't they respond when we called out to them? Travis decided to try again, this time asking more directly who they were and what they were doing. Still no response. The face in the reeds remained perfectly motionless, and I was starting to get seriously creeped out. I told Travis we should leave right now, that something was very wrong with this situation. He agreed and reached for the motor's pull cord. That's when the person in the reeds started moving toward us. Not walking exactly, but pushing through the water with this strange, jerky motion. The reeds parted as they moved, and I could see more of them now. They were wearing what looked like a dark shirt or jacket, soaked through and clinging to their body. Their arms hung at their sides, not making any swimming motions, just pushing forward through the marsh. Travis yanked on the pull cord and the motor sputtered but didn't start. He tried again, cursing under his breath, while I kept my eyes locked on the figure moving toward us. They were maybe 30 feet away now, and I could see their face more clearly. It was a man, probably in his 40s or 50s, with stringy wet hair plastered to his skull. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, and his mouth hung slightly agape. He looked wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Everything about him just looked fundamentally wrong. The motor finally caught on Travis's third try, roaring to life. We didn't waste any time. Travis threw it into gear, and we took off, the boat lurching forward as we carved a path through the narrow channel we'd come from. I looked back over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The man was still coming after us, moving faster now, thrashing through the water with that same jerky, unnatural motion. But here's the thing that really messed me up. He was keeping pace with us. Our boat was doing at least 15 miles an hour through those channels, and this guy was somehow managing to stay right behind us, crashing through the marsh vegetation like it wasn't even there. Travis opened the throttle as much as he dared, which wasn't much considering how narrow and winding the channels were. One wrong move, and we'd slam into a cypress knee or get the propeller tangled in underwater vegetation. I kept watching behind us, and for a few minutes, I thought we'd lost him. The splashing sounds had faded, and I couldn't see any movement in the reeds behind our boat. Travis started to slow down a little, both of us breathing hard, when something slammed into the side of the boat. The impact was so sudden and so hard that we both nearly fell out. The boat rocked violently, and I grabbed onto the sides to keep from going overboard. I looked down into the murky water, trying to see what had hit us. And that's when I saw him. The man from the reeds was right there, just below the surface, his pale face tilted up toward us. His eyes were still wide open, staring up through the brown water, and his mouth was moving like he was trying to say something. I screamed at Travis to go, and he slammed the throttle forward. The boat jumped ahead, and I fell backward, landing hard on the metal floor. I scrambled back up and looked behind us, expecting to see the man surfacing or grabbing onto the boat. But there was nothing. Just disturbed water and ripples spreading out across the marsh. We didn't slow down again until we were back at the boat launch. Even then, Travis kept the motor running while we both scanned the water around us, half expecting that man to come crawling out of the marsh. But nothing happened. The boat launch was empty except for a couple of trucks in the parking lot, and everything looked completely normal. It felt surreal, like we'd just woken up from a nightmare. We loaded the boat onto Travis's trailer with shaking hands, both of us too rattled to really talk about what had just happened. It wasn't until we were driving away from the boat launch that Travis finally spoke up. He asked if I thought we should call the police or the park rangers or someone. I didn't know what to say. What would we even tell them? That some guy was swimming through the marsh chasing our boat? It sounded ridiculous even thinking about it. But at the same time, something about that whole encounter felt deeply wrong. Like we'd witnessed something we weren't supposed to see. We ended up not calling anyone that day. We went back to Travis's place and spent the next few hours trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone having a mental health crisis. Maybe it was drugs. Maybe it was some kind of weird prank. But none of those explanations felt right. The way that man had moved through the water, the way he'd kept pace with our boat, the way he'd appeared under the surface and slammed into us. It wasn't human. Or if it was human, it was something that had gone far beyond what humans should be capable of. About a week later, I was scrolling through local news on my phone when I came across an article that made my blood run cold. A fisherman had gone missing in the Everglades, last seen launching his boat at the same boat launch Travis and I had used. His boat was found 3 days later, drifting empty in one of the marsh channels, with all his gear still inside. The fisherman's name was David Kowalski, 47 years old, from Fort Lauderdale. The article included a photo of him, and I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that it wasn't the same face I'd seen in the reeds. But the more I looked at it, the more certain I became. It was him, or it had been him. I don't know how to explain it, but the man we'd encountered in the marsh looked like David Kowalski, except wrong somehow. Like a copy that wasn't quite right. I called Travis and sent him the article. He called me back within 5 minutes, his voice tight with panic. He'd recognized the photo too. We debated for over an hour about whether we should contact the police and tell them what we'd seen. But what would we say? That we'd seen a missing person swimming through the marsh acting like some kind of creature? That he'd chased our boat and slammed into it from underwater? They'd think we were crazy or making it up. In the end, we decided not to say anything. I'm still not sure if that was the right decision. They found David Kowalski's body 2 weeks later, about 3 miles from where we'd encountered that man in the reeds. According to the news report, the body was in advanced stages of decomposition, consistent with having been in the water since the day he went missing. But here's what doesn't make sense. We saw that man, or something that looked like him, a full week after he'd supposedly drowned. I've tried to make sense of it 1,000 different ways, but none of them add up. Travis refuses to talk about it anymore. He sold his boat a month after the incident, and hasn't been marsh fishing since. I've been out a couple of times with other friends, but I can't enjoy it anymore. Every time I see reeds moving or catch a glimpse of something in the water, my heart starts racing and I want to leave immediately. There's something out there in those marshes. Something that wears the faces of the people it takes. I don't know what it is or why it does what it does. But I know what I saw, and I know that David Kowalski didn't just drown in an accident. Something took him, and that something is still out there, waiting in the reeds for the next person who ventures too far into the marsh. There's this river that runs through the outskirts of Timber Falls, Oregon, that my cousin Marcus and I used to fish religiously. We'd go there with our spinning rods, usually using artificial lures or salmon eggs, and we'd pull out some decent-sized rainbow trout. Those early fishing trips are actually what turned me into the hardcore angler I am today. The river wasn't particularly famous or anything, despite having a solid population of fish year-round. Most people in town avoided it because you had to park off this sketchy dirt road and then trek through about half a mile of dense forest just to reach the good fishing spots. But Marcus and I never minded the hike. In fact, we preferred it that way. The isolation made it feel like we had discovered our own secret paradise that nobody else cared about. Now, anyone who's serious about river fishing knows that the magic hours are either right before sunrise or just as the sun's going down. Most anglers prefer the morning session, getting out there before dawn breaks. But Marcus and I, we had this routine where we'd head out in the late afternoon and fish well into the night. It became our weekend ritual, our version of what other kids our age were probably doing at parties or hanging out at the mall. It was a Saturday evening in late October, and everything was going exactly as planned. We arrived at the river right as the sun was beginning its descent, and by the time we had our lines in the water, the forest around us was already getting dark. We had positioned ourselves on this flat section of riverbank where the current wasn't too strong, a spot we'd fished at least 50 times before. The setup was always the same. 2 folding chairs, a cooler with drinks and snacks, our tackle boxes spread out between us, and our rods propped up on forked sticks we'd jam into the soft earth. About 30 minutes into our session, something weird happened. Marcus got a bite, or at least he thought he did. His rod bent forward sharply, the tip almost touching the water. He grabbed it and started reeling, but whatever was on the other end wasn't fighting back. There was just this dead weight, heavy and unmoving. Marcus kept reeling anyway, grunting with the effort, and I stood up to help him if he needed it. When whatever it was finally broke the surface, both of us just froze. It wasn't a fish. It was a jacket, a thick, waterlogged winter jacket, the kind with a hood and multiple pockets. Marcus managed to drag it onto the riverbank, and we both just stared at it for a minute. The thing was soaked through, covered in river muck and algae, but that wasn't what bothered us. What bothered us was that it looked relatively new, not like something that had been in the water for months or years. The fabric wasn't torn or badly deteriorated. It just looked like someone had recently lost it in the river. Marcus made a joke about it being his lucky day, finding free clothes, but his voice had this nervous edge to it. I didn't laugh. Instead, I suggested we should probably pack up and leave. There was something unsettling about pulling that jacket out of the water, though I couldn't quite articulate why. Marcus disagreed, saying we'd just gotten there, and it was probably just some hiker who dropped their jacket upstream. He tossed it aside and we went back to fishing, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I kept glancing over at that jacket lying in a wet heap on the riverbank, and I kept thinking about how cold the water must be this time of year. Why would anyone be in that river wearing a winter jacket? And if they weren't in the river, how did the jacket end up there? About 15 minutes later, Marcus got another bite. This time when he reeled it in, it was a backpack. A full-sized hiking backpack, also soaked and covered in the same river grime. We pulled it onto the bank next to the jacket and just looked at each other. Marcus unzipped it with shaking hands. Inside was a water bottle, some soggy granola bars, a flashlight that no longer worked, and a wallet. I told Marcus not to open the wallet, that we should call the police or something, but he was already flipping it open. There was a driver's license inside, protected by a plastic sleeve. The photo showed a guy in his mid-20s with a beard and a friendly smile. His name was Trevor Addison. Marcus pulled out his phone, saying he was going to see if he could find anything about this person online. But I grabbed his arm and told him we needed to leave right now. That's when we heard it, a splashing sound coming from upstream, maybe 30 or 40 yards away from where we were. It was rhythmic, like someone walking through the shallow part of the river. Marcus and I both turned to look, squinting into the growing darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything. The forest was dense and the light was fading fast. But then I saw movement. There was definitely someone in the river, moving slowly in our direction. They were walking against the current, which should have been difficult, but they were moving steadily, almost mechanically. As they got closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, and he was completely submerged up to his chest. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just jeans from what I could tell. And here's the thing that made my blood run cold. It was late October in Oregon. The water temperature couldn't have been more than 45 or 50 degrees. Nobody in their right mind would be walking through that river half naked unless something was seriously wrong. Marcus whispered my name, his voice tight with fear, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The man in the river hadn't noticed us yet, or if he had, he wasn't showing it. He just kept walking downstream in that same steady, unnatural pace. His arms hung at his sides, not moving, not trying to maintain balance, just hanging there like dead weight. I grabbed Marcus's shoulder and gestured toward our gear, silently telling him we needed to pack up immediately. But as we started moving, One of our folding chairs scraped against a rock, making a loud metallic screech that echoed through the forest. The man in the river stopped walking. His head slowly turned in our direction, and even though it was too dark to see his face clearly, I knew he was looking right at us. For several seconds, nobody moved. Marcus and I were frozen in place, and the man in the river just stood there, the current flowing around him. Then, without warning, he started moving toward us, not walking anymore, but wading with purpose, pushing through the water with sudden urgency. That broke the spell. Marcus and I abandoned everything except our phones and started running back toward the trail. Behind us, I could hear splashing getting louder, getting closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The man had climbed out of the river and was sprinting after us through the forest. And I mean sprinting, moving faster than anyone should be able to move through dense undergrowth in near complete darkness. We ran harder than I've ever run in my life, branches whipping at our faces, our feet catching on roots and rocks. I could hear Marcus's panicked breathing ahead of me. Could hear the crashing sounds of someone chasing us through the woods. The trail back to the car felt impossibly long, like we were running through a nightmare where the destination kept moving further away. At one point, I tripped and went down hard, scraping my hands on the rocky ground. Marcus grabbed my arm and hauled me back to my feet without stopping. Behind us, the crashing sounds had gotten quieter, but I didn't know if that meant our pursuer had given up, or if he'd simply gotten better at navigating the dark forest. We finally made it to Marcus's truck and threw ourselves inside. He fumbled with the keys, nearly dropped them, then got the engine started. We peeled out of there, the truck's tires spinning on the dirt road before finally catching traction. Neither of us spoke during the 20-minute drive back to town. We were both breathing hard, both checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. When we finally pulled into a gas station, Marcus called the police. He told them everything: the jacket, the backpack, the wallet belonging to Trevor Addison, and the man who'd chased us. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out and took down our information. 2 days later, a detective called Marcus back. They'd found our fishing gear right where we'd left it, along with the jacket and backpack. They confirmed the items belonged to Trevor Addison, a 26-year-old from Portland who'd been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. He'd told his roommate he was going on a solo camping trip near Timber Falls but never came back. They searched the river and the surrounding forest but didn't find a body. They also didn't find any evidence of the man who'd chased us. The detective asked if we'd be willing to come in and look at some photos, see if we could identify who we'd seen. We agreed, but when they showed us pictures of known criminals and persons of interest in the area, none of them matched. How could they? We'd barely seen the man's face in the darkness. Marcus and I haven't been back to that river since. Part of me wonders if we should have stayed and confronted whoever that was. Maybe gotten answers about what happened to Trevor Addison. But the rational part of my brain knows we did the right thing by running. There was something fundamentally wrong about that man in the river. Something that went beyond just strange behavior. The way he moved through the freezing water. The way he pursued us through the forest in complete darkness. It wasn't natural. Sometimes late at night, I think about Trevor Addison's smiling face in that driver's license photo, and I wonder what happened to him in those woods. And I wonder if that man in the river had anything to do with it. Marcus thinks the man we saw was Trevor himself, that something had happened to him that changed him into whatever we encountered. I don't like that theory. I don't like it at all. But I also don't have a better explanation. The detective told us they're keeping the case open, that they're still looking for Trevor Addison. But it's been months now, and I haven't heard anything new. Sometimes I'll search his name online, hoping to see an update that he's been found safe, but there's never anything. Just the same missing person report from October. Marcus has this idea that we should go back there, in broad daylight this time, and try to find answers. But I've told him absolutely not. Whatever's in those woods, whoever that man in the river was, I have no interest in ever encountering it again. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some places are better left alone. This story happened about 3 months ago, and honestly, I still get chills thinking about it. It was me, Ryan, Beth, and Harper, our usual weekend crew. We're all in our early 20s, and we've been friends since high school. Ryan and I are pretty into fishing, while Beth and Harper usually just come along for the vibe, bringing snacks and music. Sometimes swimming if the weather's nice enough. It was a Friday night in late July, and we were looking for something to do. Ryan brought up this reservoir about 15 minutes outside of Asheville, North Carolina. A place we'd been to maybe half a dozen times over the past year. The reservoir is tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by thick pine forest on all sides. There's an official access point with a small parking area, but we never use that. Instead, we'd park at this abandoned logging road about a quarter mile away and hike in through the trees. It felt more adventurous that way, Plus, we could avoid any potential park rangers who might hassle us about drinking or being out there after dark. We loaded up Ryan's Jeep with our gear. 2 fishing rods, a tackle box, a cooler full of beer and White Claws, some blankets, and a portable speaker. The sun was already starting to set by the time we hit the trail. The hike took about 10 minutes, winding through dense forest until we emerged at our usual spot on the reservoir's southern shore. The water was calm and glassy, reflecting the orange and pink colors of the sunset. There's this little clearing we always set up in, with a mix of sandy soil and flat rocks that make perfect seats. The best part is how isolated it is. In all the times we'd been there, we'd never run into another person. Ryan and I got our fishing gear set up while Beth spread out blankets and Harper connected her phone to the speaker, putting on some chill indie playlist. The plan was simple. Ryan and I would fish for a bit while the girls relaxed, and later we'd all just hang out, drink, and enjoy being away from everything. By the time we had our lines in the water, the sun had fully set and the first stars were starting to appear. It was one of those perfect summer nights where the temperature drops just enough to be comfortable, and there's barely any bugs. Everything felt right. We'd been there for maybe 45 minutes when Harper noticed something that none of us had seen before. She was looking down the shoreline to our left, squinting into the growing darkness, and asked if we could see that dock over there. We all turned to look. Sure enough, about 80 yards down the shore, there was a small wooden dock jutting out into the water. It was strange because we'd been to this reservoir multiple times, and none of us had ever noticed a dock there before. Ryan said maybe it was new, that the Park Service had built it recently, but something about it seemed off to me. The dock looked old and weathered, not new at all. If it had been there all along, how had we never noticed it? Beth suggested we should check it out, but I was hesitant. There was something about that dock that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't explain why. Ryan agreed with Beth, though, saying we should at least take a look since it was close by. Harper seemed neutral about it, so I was outvoted. We left our gear where it was and started walking along the shoreline toward the dock. The forest came right up to the water's edge in most places, making us pick our way carefully over rocks and exposed roots. As we got closer, I could see more details. The dock was definitely old, with several boards looking rotted or missing entirely. There were no boats tied to it, no fishing gear, nothing to indicate anyone had used it recently. When we finally reached it, we all stood there for a moment, just looking at it. The dock extended about 15 feet out into the water, and at the end of it was something that made my stomach tighten. There was a fishing rod, lying flat on the dock's surface with its line trailing into the dark water. Next to it was a small cooler, the kind you'd bring for a solo fishing trip. Ryan stepped onto the dock first, testing the boards carefully to make sure they'd hold his weight. They creaked and groaned, but seemed stable enough. Beth and Harper followed him, but I stayed on the shore, watching. I had this growing feeling of dread that I couldn't shake. Ryan walked to the end of the dock and picked up the fishing rod, examining it. He called back to us that the line was still baited, like someone had been actively fishing, and then just left everything behind. Harper asked if we should open the cooler, and before I could say that maybe we shouldn't, Beth had already flipped the lid open. Inside was a mostly empty 6-pack of beer, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic, and a smartphone. The phone's screen was cracked, but the device was still on, showing 67% battery. Beth picked it up and tried to unlock it, but it was password protected. She said we should probably turn it into the police or something, that someone had clearly lost their stuff out here. That's when I noticed something that made me go cold. In the water, just off the side of the dock, there were bubbles rising to the surface. Small bubbles at first, then larger ones, like something was releasing air from below. I pointed it out and everyone went quiet, all of us staring at that spot in the water. Ryan said it was probably just a fish or some decomposing vegetation releasing gas, which sounded reasonable. But the bubbles kept coming, a steady stream of them breaking the surface. And then we heard something that made us all freeze, a voice muffled and distant coming from beneath the water. It sounded like someone trying to speak, but the words were garbled and unintelligible. Harper grabbed Ryan's arm, her eyes wide with terror, and whispered that we needed to leave right now. Beth was backing away from the edge of the dock, her hand covering her mouth. I was already turning to head back toward our spot, when Ryan did something that I still can't believe. He got down on his hands and knees at the edge of the dock and looked down into the water. He was trying to see what was down there, trying to see where that voice was coming from. I yelled at him to get away from the edge, but he ignored me. He was completely fixated on the water, leaning further and further over the side. That's when something grabbed him. I didn't see it clearly, couldn't make out what it was in the dark water, but something shot up from below and wrapped around Ryan's wrist. He screamed and tried to pull back, but whatever had him was strong. Beth and I rushed onto the dock, grabbing Ryan's other arm and his shoulders, trying to pull him away from the edge. Harper was screaming, fumbling with her phone to turn on the flashlight. The dock was shaking and creaking beneath us as we struggled. And I was terrified the whole thing was going to collapse and dump us all into the water. When Harper finally got her flashlight on and pointed it at the water, I saw something that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a hand gripping Ryan's wrist, pale and waterlogged, the skin wrinkled and pruned like it had been submerged for days. But attached to that hand was an arm, and attached to that arm was a face just below the surface. The face was bloated and discolored, the eyes milky white and staring up at us. The mouth was open, and I realized the garbled voice we'd heard was coming from this thing. This person or corpse or whatever it was beneath the dock. Beth screamed and yanked harder on Ryan, and suddenly whatever was holding him let go. We all fell backward onto the dock, the boards cracking beneath our combined weight. Ryan scrambled to his feet, cradling his wrist, and we all started running back toward the shore. Behind us, I could hear splashing in the water, like something was thrashing around near the dock. We didn't stop to look back. We just ran along the shoreline toward where we'd left our gear, Harper's flashlight beam bouncing wildly as we sprinted through the darkness. When we reached our spot, we didn't even bother packing things up properly. We grabbed what we could carry and started running toward the trail that would take us back to Ryan's Jeep. I was carrying the cooler and one of the fishing rods. Beth had the blankets, Harper had her speaker, and Ryan just ran empty-handed, still clutching his wrist. The trail through the forest felt twice as long in the darkness, every shadow looking like something was lurking just out of sight. We could hear something moving through the trees parallel to us, keeping pace with our running. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. We burst out of the forest and reached Ryan's Jeep, piling inside and locking the doors immediately. Ryan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition, but he finally managed it, and we tore out of there, the Jeep's tires spitting gravel as we flew down the logging road. None of us spoke during the drive back to town. We were all breathing hard, all trying to process what had just happened. When we finally pulled into a gas station parking lot with bright lights and other people around, we all felt safe enough to start talking. Ryan's wrist had marks on it, red and purple bruises in the shape of fingers. He said it felt like whatever had grabbed him was trying to pull him into the water, that if we hadn't been there to pull him back, it would have succeeded. Harper wanted to call the police immediately, but what would we tell them? That we were illegally hanging out at a reservoir after dark and a waterlogged corpse tried to drown our friend? Beth pointed out that we still had that phone from the dock's cooler, that we could turn it in and at least report that we'd found someone's abandoned belongings. But when she checked her bag, the phone wasn't there. She must have dropped it when we were running. We debated for over an hour about what to do. Eventually, we decided that we'd call the police and report what we'd found, leaving out the part about the thing in the water. We'd just say we found an abandoned fishing rod, cooler, and phone on a dock, and were concerned that someone might be in trouble. Ryan called from a payphone outside the gas station, giving the police the location of the reservoir and describing what we'd found. He didn't give his name, just hung up after providing the information. That was 3 months ago. I've checked the local news regularly since then, searching for any reports of missing persons or bodies found in that reservoir. There's been nothing. No news stories, no updates, nothing to indicate the police ever followed up on Ryan's anonymous tip. It's like that whole incident never happened, except for the bruises on Ryan's wrist that took 2 weeks to fully fade. The four of us haven't been back to that reservoir, and we've barely talked about what happened. Harper refuses to go fishing anywhere now, and Beth has nightmares about being pulled underwater. Ryan and I went back to our regular fishing spots on different lakes and rivers, but it's not the same anymore. Every time we're near water at night, every time we see an old dock or abandoned fishing gear, I think about that face beneath the surface, those milky white eyes staring up at us, that waterlogged hand gripping Ryan's wrist with inhuman strength. I don't know what that thing was. Part of me wants to believe it was just a drowning victim, someone who died in that reservoir and whose body had somehow gotten caught beneath the dock. But that doesn't explain the grip strength, or the voice we heard, or the way it seemed to track us through the forest as we ran. Sometimes late at night, I'll get a text from Ryan, or Beth, or Harper. Just a simple, "You awake?" or "Can't sleep." I know they're thinking about it too, replaying that night in their heads, trying to make sense of what we experienced. We've theorized that maybe someone uses that reservoir to dispose of bodies, or that there's something in the water that preserves corpses and somehow keeps them animate. But every theory sounds more ridiculous than the last. All I know for sure is that there are some places that aren't meant for people. Some waters that hold secrets better left undiscovered. That reservoir is one of them, and whatever's living beneath that old dock, I hope it stays there. I hope no one else ever has to see what we saw, or feel what Ryan felt when that hand wrapped around his wrist and tried to pull him down into the dark water. There's this lake up in northern Michigan called Blackwood Lake that I've been fishing since I was about 14 years old. My Uncle Dean owned a cabin about half a mile from the shore, and every summer my family would spend a week up there. The lake itself is pretty big, maybe 2 miles across at its widest point, and it's surrounded by dense forest on all sides. Most tourists stick to the main beach area on the eastern shore where there's a boat launch and some picnic tables, but the western side of the lake is almost completely untouched. That's where I always preferred to fish. The thing about Blackwood Lake is that it has this reputation among locals. Nothing concrete, just whispers and old stories that people don't really take seriously. Supposedly, back in the 1950s, a family drowned there when their boat capsized during a storm. The father, mother, and their 8-year-old daughter all went under and never came back up. They dragged the lake for weeks but only ever recovered the father's body. The mother and daughter were never found. Over the years, people claimed to hear things out on the water at night, voices calling out, sounds of splashing where there shouldn't be any. But like I said, nobody really believed it. It was just one of those spooky local legends that every small town seems to have. This happened last August when I was up at the cabin with my girlfriend, Michelle. We'd been dating for about 8 months, and she'd never been to the lake before. I was excited to show her around, teach her how to fish, all that stuff. We arrived on a Thursday evening, and I suggested we go out fishing first thing Friday morning, right at sunrise when the base would be most active. Michelle wasn't super enthusiastic about waking up that early, but she agreed because she knew how much it meant to me. We woke up around 5:30 a.m. and made the short hike down to the lake, carrying my fishing gear and a small cooler with breakfast and coffee. The sun hadn't come up yet, and the forest was still dark and quiet. When we reached the shore, I could see the lake stretched out before us, perfectly still and covered in a thin layer of mist. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of morning that makes you remember why you love fishing in the first place. I had a small inflatable raft that I'd brought down the night before and hidden in some bushes. It was just big enough for 2 people. Nothing fancy, but it got the job done. We pushed off from shore and I paddled us out to my favorite spot, a deep section about 200 yards from the western shore where the water drops off sharply. The mist was thicker out there, reducing visibility to maybe 30 or 40 feet in any direction. Michelle commented that it was kind of creepy being surrounded by fog like that, but I assured her it would burn off once the sun came up. I handed her one of my rods and showed her how to cast, and for the next half hour we just sat there in comfortable silence, enjoying the peace and quiet. The sun started rising around 6:15, and just like I'd predicted, the mist began to thin out. That's when Michelle pointed something out that I hadn't noticed before. She asked if I heard that, and I stopped reeling to listen. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal sounds of the lake. Water lapping against the raft, birds starting to wake up in the forest, that kind of thing. But then I heard it, a voice, distant and faint, coming from somewhere out in the mist. It sounded like someone calling for help. I told Michelle to stay quiet, and we both listened intently. The voice came again, clearer this time. It was definitely someone yelling, though I couldn't make out the exact words. My first thought was that maybe another fisherman had gotten into trouble. Maybe their boat had capsized or they'd fallen overboard. I grabbed the paddle and started moving in the direction of the voice, calling out to ask if they were okay. Michelle grabbed my arm and said maybe we should head back to shore and call for help instead. But I told her we should at least check it out first. If someone was in trouble, every second could matter. We paddled through the thinning mist, following the sound of the voice. It kept calling out, always seeming to be just ahead of us, just out of sight. After about 5 minutes of paddling, I realized we'd traveled much further from shore than I'd intended. I could barely see the tree line anymore. Michelle was getting nervous, saying we should turn back, but I wanted to find whoever was calling out. The voice sounded desperate, scared, and I couldn't just ignore it. Then something strange happened. The voice changed. It was still calling out, still sounding distressed, but the tone had shifted. It almost sounded like it was mimicking someone, like an echo that wasn't quite right. Michelle noticed it too and grabbed my shoulder, her fingernails digging into my skin through my shirt. She whispered that we needed to leave right now, that something was wrong. I was about to agree when the voice called out again, and this time I could make out the words clearly. It was calling my name. Not just my name, but calling it exactly the way Michelle pronounced it, with that slight upward inflection she always used. I looked at Michelle and she looked back at me, her face pale. She hadn't said anything. The voice came again, calling my name from somewhere in the mist, using Michelle's voice. And then another voice joined it, this one using my voice, calling out Michelle's name. We were hearing ourselves out there on the water, our own voices calling to each other from somewhere we couldn't see. I didn't wait to hear anymore. I grabbed the paddle and started moving us back toward where I thought the shore was. But in all our paddling around, I'd gotten disoriented. The mist was still thick in patches, making it hard to see landmarks. Michelle was crying quietly, her hands gripping the sides of the raft so hard her knuckles had turned white. The voices kept calling, sometimes using our voices, sometimes switching to other voices, other tones. At one point, I heard what sounded like a child laughing, high-pitched and echoing across the water. We paddled for what felt like forever, the voices following us through the mist. Sometimes they'd sound close, like they were right next to the raft, and I'd spin around expecting to see someone in the water beside us. But there was never anyone there, just empty water and fog. Michelle started praying under her breath, something I'd never heard her do before. I kept paddling, my arms burning with the effort, desperately searching for the shoreline. Finally, after what must have been 20 minutes but felt like hours, I saw trees emerging from the mist. We'd made it back to shore, though not the same spot we'd launched from. I didn't care. I just wanted to be off that lake. We dragged the raft onto the shore and started hiking back toward the cabin, leaving all our fishing gear behind in the raft. Neither of us spoke during the walk back. What was there to say? We'd both heard it, both experienced the same impossible thing. When we got back to the cabin, Michelle immediately started packing her stuff. She said she wanted to leave, that she didn't feel safe there anymore. I tried to convince her to stay, telling her we could just avoid the lake for the rest of the trip, but she wasn't having it. She said that whatever was out there on the water, it knew our names, it knew our voices, and she didn't want to be anywhere near it. I couldn't really argue with that logic. We packed up the car and left that same afternoon, cutting our week-long trip short by 5 days. The drive home was quiet. Michelle stared out the window for most of it, and I could tell she was still processing what had happened. When we finally got back to our apartment, she said she needed some time to think, that she wanted to stay at her sister's place for a few days. I understood. Hell, I probably would have done the same thing in her position. She left, and I spent the next few days researching Blackwood Lake, trying to find any information about what we'd experienced. That's when I found the old newspaper articles about the drowning in 1957. The family that had died, their names were Daniel and Patricia Morrison, and their daughter was named Emma. The article described how witnesses heard them calling for help as their boat went under, how their voices echoed across the water as searchers tried to find them in the darkness. The article specifically mentioned that the search party kept hearing voices calling out from different directions, making it difficult to locate where the family had actually gone under. Some of the searchers claimed the voices didn't sound quite right, like they were being distorted or mimicked by something. Reading that made my blood run cold. The same thing had happened to us. Those voices on the water, calling out, echoing, mimicking. Was it the Morrison family, still out there somehow, still calling for help after all these years? Or was it something else? Something that had been in that lake long before the Morrisons drowned. Something that had learned to use their voices. I called my Uncle Dean and asked him about the lake's history, specifically about the drowning. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that, yes, he knew about it, and yes, he'd heard stories from other locals about strange things happening on the water. He said that's why he never kept a boat, why he never went out on the lake himself despite living so close to it. He said the lake took something from the Morrison family, and whatever it took, it still had. He told me I was smart to leave when I did. Michelle and I broke up about a month later. She said it wasn't because of what happened at the lake, that we'd just grown apart. But I knew better. Every time she looked at me, I could see the memory of those voices in her eyes, the fear and confusion of that morning on the water. We couldn't move past it, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The lake had taken something from us too, even if it wasn't our lives. I sold the inflatable raft online and haven't been fishing since. My uncle offered to let me use the cabin again this past summer, but I declined. I have no interest in ever going back to Blackwood Lake, no desire to hear those voices again. Sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear them. My name being called in Michelle's voice, her name being called in mine, echoing across dark water that exists only in my memory now. My Uncle Dean died last month. Heart attack, sudden and unexpected. At the funeral, his neighbor from up in Michigan pulled me aside and told me something that's been keeping me up at night. He said that in the weeks before he died, Uncle Dean had started talking about hearing voices at night, coming from the direction of the lake. Voices calling his name, using the voices of his late wife, his parents, people he'd lost over the years. The neighbor said Uncle Dean had become obsessed with the lake, that he'd started walking down to the shore at night, standing at the water's edge like he was listening for something. They found his body at the cabin, but the cause of death was listed as drowning. His lungs were full of lake water. But here's the thing that doesn't make sense. He was found in his bed, fully clothed, with no indication he'd been near the water. The only moisture in the cabin was the lake water in his lungs and soaking his sheets. The police ruled it a heart attack followed by some kind of medical event that caused pulmonary edema. But I know better. The lake called to him, just like it called to me and Michelle. And unlike us, he answered. I'm writing this because I need people to know about Blackwood Lake, about what's out there in the mist. If you ever find yourself near that lake, if you ever hear voices calling to you from the water, don't answer them. Don't try to help. Don't investigate. Just leave as fast as you can and don't ever go back. Because whatever's in that lake, it's patient. It can wait years, decades even, for you to let your guard down. And when you do, it will call to you again, using the voices of everyone you've ever loved, and it won't stop until you answer. My name is Kyle, and I've been fishing the lakes and rivers around Spokane, Washington for most of my adult life. There's something therapeutic about it, you know? Just you, the water, and whatever might be lurking below the surface. My buddy Connor and I used to go out at least once a week, sometimes more if our schedules allowed it. We were both pretty serious about it, always looking for new spots to try, new techniques to master. We prided ourselves on being the kind of fishermen who weren't afraid to go where others wouldn't, hiking deep into the wilderness to find those hidden gems that nobody else knew about. This story takes place last September at a lake called Mirror Lake, about an hour's drive northeast of the city. It's not the most remote spot we'd ever fished, but it's definitely secluded enough that you won't run into crowds. The lake is surrounded by old-growth forest, mostly pine and fir trees that tower over the water like silent sentinels. There's a small gravel parking area at the trailhead, and from there it's about a 30-minute hike down to the shore. The trail isn't well maintained, which probably explains why the lake doesn't see much traffic despite being relatively accessible. Connor and I had been planning this trip for about 2 weeks. We'd heard from another fisherman that Mirror Lake had a healthy population of rainbow trout and some surprisingly large bass. The guy who told us about it said the fishing was incredible, but he also mentioned something strange. He said that in all the times he'd been there, he'd never seen another person at the lake, not once. He called it his private fishing hole and seemed almost reluctant to share the information with us. But after we bought him a few beers, he eventually gave us directions and some tips about the best spots to fish. We arrived at the trailhead around 3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. The plan was to hike in, set up camp near the shore, fish through the evening and into the night, then pack up and leave Sunday morning. Night fishing was something Connor and I both enjoyed, especially during the fall when the air gets crisp and the fish tend to be more active after dark. We had all our gear: 2 tents, sleeping bags, a cooler with food and drinks, our fishing equipment, and headlamps for when the sun went down. The hike to the lake was uneventful, just a steady downward slope through dense forest. We could hear birds calling to each other in the canopy above, and occasionally we'd spot a squirrel or chipmunk darting across the trail. When we finally emerged from the trees and got our first look at Mirror Lake, I understood immediately how it had gotten its name. The water was absolutely still, reflecting the surrounding forest and the sky above like a perfect mirror. It was beautiful in an almost unsettling way, too perfect, too quiet. We found a good spot to set up camp about 20 yards back from the shore. A flat area with enough room for both tents and a small fire pit that someone had used before us. While Connor started setting up the tents, I walked down to the water's edge to scope out the best fishing spots. The lake was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 300 yards across at its widest point. The water was incredibly clear, and I could see straight down to the rocky bottom in the shallower areas near shore. As I was standing there, I noticed something odd. There were no fish visible in the shallows, no minnows darting around, no signs of life at all, really. That struck me as strange for a lake that was supposedly so well stocked. I mentioned it to Connor when I got back to camp, but he just shrugged it off, saying the fish were probably in deeper water. We finished setting up, got a small fire going, and made some dinner as the sun started to set. By 7 p.m., we had our fishing rods ready and were positioned at the water's edge, casting our lines out into the darkening lake. Connor was using a spinner bait while I had on a rubber worm rig, both proven techniques for catching bass in low-light conditions. The first hour of fishing was completely dead. Not a single bite, not even a nibble. That wasn't too unusual. Sometimes fish just aren't in a feeding mood. But combined with the lack of visible fish earlier, it was starting to seem like maybe this lake wasn't as well stocked as we'd been told. Connor suggested we try different lures, so we both switched things up. He went to a crankbait, and I put on a topwater popper. Another hour passed with the same result. Nothing. It was around 9 p.m. when things started to get weird. We'd been sitting in silence for a while, both of us focused on our lines, when I felt something bump against my leg. We were sitting on these flat rocks right at the water's edge, with our feet just inches from the lake, and something had definitely touched my leg below the knee. I jerked my leg back instinctively and looked down, but the water was too dark to see anything. I asked Connor if he'd felt that, and he gave me a confused look, saying he hadn't felt anything. I tried to brush it off, figuring it was probably just a piece of driftwood floating by or maybe a fish swimming close to shore. But then it happened again, this time more forcefully. Something bumped into my leg, hard enough that I actually felt pressure, like something was pushing against it. I pulled both my legs up onto the rock and shined my headlamp down into the water. The beam illuminated the area where my feet had been, but there was nothing there, just dark water and rocks. Connor asked what was wrong, and I explained what I'd felt. He laughed it off, saying I was probably just spooked by the darkness and the quiet. Maybe he was right. We'd been sitting in near total silence for 2 hours, the only sounds being the occasional pop and crackle from our fire back at camp, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was the kind of quiet that can play tricks on your mind, make you notice things that aren't really there. I put my feet back down, closer to the rock this time, and further from the water, and we continued fishing. Another 30 minutes passed without incident. I was starting to think Connor was right, that I'd just been imagining things, when my rod suddenly bent forward with tremendous force. The tip was pulled down almost to the water's surface, and my reel started screaming as line peeled off at an incredible rate. I grabbed the rod with both hands and tried to set the hook, pulling back hard, but whatever was on the other end was strong, really strong. Connor jumped up and shined his light on my line, watching it cut through the water at a sharp angle. He was yelling at me to keep the tip up, to let it run. All the standard advice for fighting a big fish, but this didn't feel like a fish. The way it was pulling, the sheer power behind it, felt wrong somehow. Fish run in bursts, they make quick movements, they jump and thrash. This thing was just pulling steadily, relentlessly, dragging my line deeper into the lake. I fought it for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, my arms burning with the effort, before the line suddenly went slack. Whatever had been on the other end had either thrown the hook or bitten through the line. I reeled in quickly and found that the line had been severed cleanly, not frayed or broken like it would be if a fish had pulled too hard. It looked like it had been cut with scissors. Connor examined the line and said maybe I'd snagged a sharp rock, but I knew that wasn't right. Rocks don't move. Don't pull your line 40 yards out into a lake with that kind of force. We spent the next few minutes re-rigging my line and debating what I'd hooked into. Connor suggested it might have been a really big bass, or maybe even a pike, though pike weren't supposed to be in this lake according to the guy who told us about it. I didn't share my growing suspicion that whatever had grabbed my line wasn't a fish at all. We'd been fishing for hours without a single bite, and then suddenly something attacks my lure with enough force to almost pull the rod out of my hands. It didn't add up. Around 10:30 p.m., Connor got a hit. His rod bent forward and he started reeling, a big grin on his face. But the grin faded quickly as he realized what I'd already figured out. Whatever was on his line was moving the same way mine had, pulling steadily and powerfully toward deeper water. He fought it for a few minutes, his arms shaking with the effort, before his line went slack too. When he reeled in, his line had been severed in the exact same way mine had been. We looked at each other in the darkness, our headlamps casting weird shadows across our faces, and I could see the concern in Connor's eyes that I was feeling in my gut. Something was in that lake, something that wasn't a fish, and it was cutting our lines. Connor said maybe we should call it a night and try again in the morning when we could actually see what we were dealing with. I agreed immediately. There was something deeply unsettling about sitting at the edge of a dark lake, unable to see what was in the water, knowing that something down there was aware of us. We gathered up our gear and were walking back toward camp when I heard splashing behind us. I turned around and shined my light back at the water's edge. The surface was disturbed, ripples spreading out from a point about 10 feet from shore. As I watched, something broke the surface for just a moment before disappearing back under. I didn't get a clear look at it, just a glimpse of something dark and glistening, but it was definitely not a fish. It was too big, too solid looking. Connor saw it too and grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward camp. We practically ran the last 20 yards, both of us spooked in a way that felt almost childish but completely justified at the same time. When we reached our tents, we built up the fire and sat close to it, as if the light and heat could protect us from whatever was in that lake. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, listening to the sounds of the forest at night, both of us very aware of the water just yards away from where we were sitting. Around midnight, Connor asked if we should just pack up and leave. Part of me wanted to agree, wanted to hike back to the car in the darkness and get as far away from Mirror Lake as possible. But another part of me, the stubborn part that hated giving up on anything, said we should at least wait until morning. We'd come all this way, had all this gear set up. It seemed ridiculous to abandon everything because of some weird fish behavior and our own overactive imaginations. We decided to take shifts keeping watch, which sounds paranoid as I write this, but at the time it felt necessary. Connor took the first shift while I tried to sleep in my tent. I say tried because actual sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and worst of all, the occasional splash from the direction of the lake. Each splash made my heart race, made me wonder what was out there in the darkness, moving through the water. Around 2 a.m., Connor woke me up, saying it was my turn to keep watch. He looked exhausted, his eyes red and heavy-lidded. I asked if anything had happened, and he shook his head. But something in his expression told me he wasn't being completely honest. He went into his tent and zipped it shut while I took up position by the fire, feeding it more wood to keep it burning bright. The next 2 hours were some of the longest of my life. I sat there in the darkness, my headlamp switched off to preserve battery, watching the fire and listening to every sound. Twice, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the shallow water near shore. A wet, sloshing sound like someone or something wading through the lake. Both times I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but there was never anything visible, just dark water and the reflection of my light on the surface. Around 3:30 a.m., something happened that made me seriously consider waking Connor and insisting we leave immediately. I was staring into the fire, maybe half asleep despite my best efforts to stay alert, when I heard my name being called. Not shouted, just spoken in a normal conversational tone, but clear enough to snap me fully awake. It was Connor's voice, coming from the direction of the lake. I turned toward his tent and saw that the zipper was still closed. Saw the shape of him sleeping inside through the thin tent fabric. If Connor was in his tent, who had just called my name? I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked toward the water. At first I didn't see anything. Then I heard it again. Kyle, spoken in that same casual tone, still using Connor's voice. It was coming from the lake, from somewhere near the water's edge, but slightly to the left of our camp. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and pointed it in that direction. The beam illuminated the shore, the rocks, the lapping water, but nothing else. No person, no animal, nothing that could have been speaking. I swept the light back and forth, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the source of the voice remained invisible. And then I heard it a third time. Kyle, come here. Still in Connor's voice. But now there was something off about it. The tone was slightly wrong, the inflection not quite matching how Connor actually spoke. I woke Connor up immediately, shaking his tent and telling him we needed to leave right now. He was groggy and confused, asking what was wrong, and I told him that something had been calling my name using his voice. That got his attention. He unzipped his tent and came out, looking around our camp with wide, alert eyes. I expected him to laugh it off, to tell me I'd been dreaming or mishear something, but he didn't. Instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that during his watch, he'd heard someone calling his name using my voice. He'd convinced himself he'd imagined it, that he was just tired and his mind was playing tricks on him. But now that I was reporting the same thing, there was no denying it. Something in or around that lake was mimicking our voices, trying to lure us toward the water. We didn't bother packing up properly. We just grabbed our most important gear, our phones, keys, wallets, and started hiking back toward the trailhead in the darkness. The hike up was treacherous, our headlamps providing minimal light on the overgrown trail, both of us stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste to get away from that lake. Behind us, I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, like something was following us through the forest. But every time I turned around and shined my light back down the trail, there was nothing there. We made it back to Connor's truck around 5 a.m., just as the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky. We threw our gear in the back and got out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. Neither of us spoke during the drive back to Spokane. What was there to say? We'd both experienced the same impossible thing, heard our own voices calling to us from the darkness near that lake. When we got back to town, Connor dropped me off at my apartment and said he needed some time to process what had happened. I understood completely. I spent the next week researching Mirror Lake, trying to find any information about strange occurrences or local legends associated with it. What I found disturbed me more than I expected. There were several old news articles from the 1980s and 90s about missing hikers and fishermen in that area. Most of them had last been seen heading toward Mirror Lake. In each case, Search parties had found some of their gear near the lake's shore, but the people themselves were never recovered. One article mentioned that searchers had reported hearing voices calling out from the forest around the lake, voices that sounded like the missing people. Several searchers claimed they'd followed these voices deeper into the woods, only to realize they were being led in circles, that the voices were always just ahead of them, always just out of sight. I called the guy who'd originally told us about Mirror Lake, wanting to ask him if he'd ever experienced anything strange there. His phone number was disconnected. I tried to find him on social media, but he seemed to have deleted all his accounts. It was like he'd disappeared completely. That's when I started to wonder if maybe he'd known more than he'd let on. If maybe he'd sent us to that lake on purpose. But why? What would he have to gain from putting us in danger? Connor and I haven't been fishing together since that night. It's not that we're avoiding each other exactly, but there's this unspoken agreement between us that we don't want to talk about what happened, don't want to acknowledge it out loud. I've gone fishing a few times since then with other friends, but I can't enjoy it anymore. Every time I'm near water at night, every time I'm in a quiet, isolated spot, I find myself listening for my name being called in a voice that isn't quite right. Last week, I got a text message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Kyle, come back." The area code was local to Spokane, but when I tried calling the number back, it went straight to a disconnected message. I showed the text to Connor, and he went pale. He said he'd gotten the same message 2 days earlier, with his name instead of mine, from a different unknown number. We both blocked the numbers and tried to forget about it, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever's at Mirror Lake isn't done with us yet. It called to us once, used our own voices against us, and now it's reaching out across the distance, reminding us that it knows who we are. I don't know what it wants or why it's targeting us specifically, but I do know one thing for certain. I will never, ever go back to Mirror Lake. And if you're ever near Spokane, if you ever hear about a secluded fishing spot called Mirror Lake, do yourself a favor and stay far, far away. Some places are beautiful for a reason. They're bait, luring you in with the promise of peace and solitude, only to reveal their true nature when you're too isolated, too vulnerable to escape. Mirror Lake is one of those places, and whatever lives there is still waiting, still calling out in stolen voices, hoping for someone foolish enough to answer.